Here are the 3 immigration facts you need to know before you adopt a child from outside of the US, especially if your plan is to have them immigrate to the US. I am U.S. immigration attorney Lilian Chukwurah, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the U.S. immigration law system. Whatever it looks like, we work within that system. There are 3 ways to bring an adopted child to the US, and each of this may apply depending on the country that you are adopting the child from. If you are a US citizen, you can use any of these options depending on the country. If you are a permanent resident, then only 2 of these options would apply to you. So let's start. The first one is if the child lives in a Hague Convention country and you, the adoptive parent, is a US citizen, then the Hague Convention applies and you must follow the process in the Hague Convention to get the child. You cannot, and please hear me when I say this, under the Hague Convention, you cannot go to the home country of that child, do the full adoption, and then try to file for the child later. No. The Hague adoption countries, the reason that they exist, the reason that this agreement exists between countries is to make sure that the proper process is taken with the adoption. So, with a Hague Convention country adoption, you have to go through an adoption service provider. You have to be designated as an adoptive parent by USCIS. You have to basically go through specific forms with USCIS before the adoption takes place in the home country, not after. It has to take place before. Under the Hague Convention, all the USCIS stuff has to take place before you go ahead and adopt the child. That's like step 3 in the process. Okay, not step 1, not step 2. So it's really important that you're following the right process, because if you do the adoption first, that can basically make it impossible for you to bring that child to the US later. So you want to make sure if the child is in a Hague Convention country and you are a US citizen, that you are following the Hague Convention steps before you do the adoption. Okay? Second way is orphan process. This orphan process applies to children that are in countries that are not Hague Convention countries. And US citizens and permanent residents can use this process if the child is not in a Hague Convention country. Permanent residents can use this process even if the child is in a Hague Convention country, because the Hague Convention country only applies between US citizens trying to adopt from that Hague Convention country. Okay? Really important. Really important. So the Hague Convention does not apply to permanent residents, only US citizens. So orphan process can be used by permanent residents and US citizens when the child is not in a Hague Convention country. The orphan process has its own requirements where you have to prove that the child is actually an orphan or legally an orphan. Those are 2 different things. A child can be actually an orphan where both parents are deceased. A child can be legally an orphan where, let's say, one parent is deceased and the other parent is not able to take care of the child. That child will be considered an orphan. Where both parents has deserted the child, they left the child without a trace, that child is also considered legally an orphan, even though both parents are still alive. Okay, if both parents give up their legal rights, give the child up to the system in their country, and then through that system you adopt the child, that child is considered legally an orphan, even though both parents are still alive. So you really need to make sure, right? You really need to make sure which process, right? Is the child actually an orphan, or is the child legally an orphan? And you need to prove that to USCIS. All right. In that situation with an orphan adoption, you are still going through an adoption service provider because they have to do a home study. USCIS has to say that you are fit to adopt. Okay. And they have to designate that child as an orphan for adoption. All right. So that's required under the orphan process. Then you go through that whole process. The child can then have an interview at the embassy and then come. Here's the part that's different from the Hague Convention. The adoption of the child in the home country can take place before you do the orphan process in the US with USCIS. Okay, that process can take place before. With the Hague Convention, it cannot take place before. So if you are already in a situation where you have adopted the child and now you are trying to bring them to the US, you may want to look at the orphan process because there's no waiting period that you have to do. You just have to file the applications, have the evidence of the legal adoption, and the fact that the child is in fact legally an orphan. Okay? And then the third option, if you are not able to prove that the child is an orphan, you will need to have 2 years of legal and physical custody of the child. This means either the adoption took place 2 years ago and now you have 2 years of physical custody, or you had temporary guardianship over the child while the adoption process was going on. But that's the legal part of it. Let's talk about the physical. The physical presence means that you are physically in that country with that child for 2 years before you file an I-130 for the child. Okay? So if the child is not an orphan and it's not a Hague Convention country, your option is to physically live with the child for 2 years. And if you do not do that, you can adopt the child in your home country, live with them for 2 years, and then file the petition to bring them to the US. If you choose not to live with the child, or it's inconvenient for you to live with the child and the child is not an orphan when they were adopted, guess what? You cannot file for that child to come to the US as your child. So that's why this is really important, knowing the difference between Hague Convention, orphan adoption, and the home residency, 2-year home residency with the child. Okay, physical presence with the child in your home, where you are the primary caretaker for that child. The child must be under the age of 16 when the adoption becomes final. This is really important because I've had people come to me and they adopted the child when they were 18 or 21 or over the age of 16, and they want to know, how can I bring this child to the US? This child is in fact an orphan. I've been taking care of them forever, but I just finally did the adoption. Well, here's the thing. The final adoption, the adoption certificate needs to say that that adoption took place when the child was under the age of 16. If the child was adopted after the age of 16, we need to look at whether you adopted a sibling that's under the age of 16, then the child can be up to 18 when you adopt them. But if there's no sibling that you're also adopting at the same time, then the age cutoff is for that adoption to be final by the time before the child turns 16. Once they turn 16, yes, you adopted them. Yes, they are your children. However, for immigration purposes, you are not able to file for them to come to the US. So that's why I want you to know this before you start the adoption process, because it matters. How quickly you move for the adoption matters. Even if you've been taking care of the child since they were 2 years old, if you do not finalize the adoption before they turn 16, USCIS will not recognize that adoption for immigration purposes. Okay, there's no de facto adoption just because you've been caring for the child and sending money and doing all of that. That's not what's going to make the difference here. It's the final adoption decree. Okay, so child has to be under the age of 16 when the adoption is finalized, or under the age of 18 if you are also adopting a sibling of that child. Before you start the adoption process, you want to get a consultation with a U.S. immigration lawyer and an adoption attorney in the country where the child lives. Okay? You want to do these two things because the attorney in that country where the child lives can tell you what is the requirements for adoption. There are countries where if you are single, you will not be able to adopt. Okay, there are countries where if you are not also a citizen of that country, you will not be able to adopt. There are countries where if you are a woman and you are under a certain age, you will not be able to adopt. There are countries that if you are married and you are trying to adopt on your own without your spouse, they will not allow it. So it's really important that you know what the rules are in that country that you are trying to adopt from before you even start the process. Whether it's the Hague Convention process or the Orphan Process or the home residency together process, okay? Whichever process that would be the one that you will go through, you want to have that conversation with an adoption attorney, a family law attorney in the country where the child resides, so that you know what the requirements are and that you are following the requirements, that you are meeting the requirements for that country. And you can know if you are actually legally able to adopt from that country. I have seen people start the process, they go to an orphanage, they meet the child, they're in love, and then they find out when they try to adopt that, oh, I'm not allowed to adopt from this country. And in those situations, it is so heartbreaking. So you really want to start there. Meet with an adoption attorney in that country, know all the requirements for adopting from that country before you even start. Because if you're going through the Hague Convention process or the Orphan process, you will have to engage an adoption service provider in the US. And when you meet with them, they will tell you the requirements, but you want to go into that meeting knowing what is required of you from that country so you have it ready to go and waste as little time as possible. Okay? And then you want to meet with a US immigration attorney to figure out which process actually applies to you. Is it the Hague Convention country? Is the child in a Hague Convention country? Are you a US citizen? Those things matter. I have had situations where the adoption took place before the parent became a U.S. citizen. They are now a U.S. citizen. The adoption took place before they became a U.S. citizen. And that country was a Hague Convention country at the time the adoption took place. However, they do not have to go through the Hague Convention process because they were a permanent resident at the time. It doesn't matter what you are at the time of actually filing the application, is what you were when the adoption took place. And because they were a permanent resident when the adoption took place, they were not required to go through the Hague Convention process, and they can still file for the child. And I've had the opposite situation where someone thought, oh, I can just do the orphan process. And it turns out, no, you can't because you're a US citizen. But they have went and done the adoption in that Hague Convention country. And now they have to try to undo all of that and start the process of the Hague Convention in the US. So you really want to meet with an immigration attorney in the US that's versed in US immigration law that can tell you which process you qualify for, whether it's orphan, whether you are actually willing to have that physical presence in your home country with that child. All of those things needs to be discussed. You need to know all of that. Which one will work best for you? Is this a true orphan case, or is this a legally is the child legally considered an orphan? And if they are legally considered an orphan, are they still living with that parent that supposedly abandoned them, right? Are they still in the same household as both parents? So it's really important that you're having those conversations, because if the parents that, abandoned them or that no longer wants to be their parent is the one still taking care of them, it's going to be hard for you to argue that they are legally an orphan. So that's why you want to have all that conversation beforehand with a U.S. immigration attorney to know where to start, which process will work for you. So those are the three things you need to know before you start your adoption process when you know you want to file for that child to join you in the U.S. If you are in the process of filing for an adopted child, or you want to know what are the requirements to file for this child, what do I need to do, how can I get assistance through this process, feel free to schedule a strategy session with me. This is a free 15-minute session where we talk about your situation, figure out what your best steps are to make sure you are able to legally bring that child to live with you in the US. And you can schedule that free strategy session by going to my website, lilylegal.com, click on contact us, and select a date and time that works best for you for us to talk about your situation.